Okay, so this next analysis here that I want to do goes with one of our next writers, absolutely one of my favorites, who's Randall Jarrell. Now, I know you read and have a couple poems. You have Going to Refer to My Norton, 90 Degrees North in here, which is my subject of focus for this particular unit. You also have Well Water and Thinking of the Lost World, which we'll dive into also. As I said, Randall Jarrell is one of my all-time favorite writers and poets, and he lived a pretty tumultuous life, so we want to kind of really dissect that and grow through some of these poems that we have here. So I don't have an audio recording of this one right next to me as we did with the last one, but I did put several clips up on our Moodle page, and I really encourage you to watch him as you would also listen to him because we do have some recordings of it, which is awesome. So I'm going to take myself out for a second here, and I'm going to go through. This follows along exactly with your Norton. It's not easy for me to hide my Norton up against the screen, so I'm going to go off. The Poetry Foundation's pretty awesome with their portrayal and how they put poems up here. So I'm going to go through this poem quick, and I cannot wait next week to hear kind of what you have to say about it, but just dissect it a little bit more to give you a little help if you're trying to figure it out for yourself. So he says, "At home in my flannel gown, like a bear to its flow, I clambered to bed up the globe's impossible sides. I sailed all night till at last with my black beard, my furs and my dogs, I stood at the northern pole. There in the childish night my companions lay frozen, the stiff furs knocked at my starveling throat, and I gave my great sigh, the flakes came huddling. Were they really my end? In the darkness I turned to my rest. Here the flag snaps in the glare and silence of the unbroken ice. I stand here, the dogs bark, my beard is black, and I stare at the North Pole. And now what? Why go back? Turn as I please, my step is to the south. The world, my world, spins on this final point of cold and wretchedness. All lines, all winds end in this whirlpool I at last discover. And it is meaningless. In the child's bed after the night's voyage, in that warm world where people work and suffer for the end, that crowns the pain in that cloud, cuckoo land, I reached my north and had meaning. Here at the actual pole of my existence, where all that I have done is meaningless, where I die or live by accident alone, where, living or dying, I am still alone. Here, where north, the night, the berg of death, crowd me out of the ignorant darkness, I see at last that all the knowledge I wrung from the darkness, that the darkness flung me, is worthless as ignorance. Nothing comes from nothing, the darkness from the darkness. Pain comes from the darkness, and we call it wisdom. It is pain." Whew, okay. What an awesome poem, and a lot of different interpretations of it, so I encourage you to think about the title, 90 Degrees North, and let's just kind of go through this a couple stanzas at a time to give you a little sense of what he's talking about. It to me, it's a very sort of dreamlike setting to this. What I think of like almost initial hopelessness, which transcends and goes into loneliness and disappointment. I wonder, and I'm interested in our questions next time to think, who do you think is the speaker of this poem? Sometimes, to me, it feels like a child. Sometimes it feels like an adult. So, sort of in the beginning parts here, it definitely sounds like a child to me a little bit more. At least having a childish perspective, especially when you think of the North Pole. That's such a common phrase and, you know, sort of common thing that kids associate with Christmas and you know, a tradition that we pass on. Could it be both? Perhaps it's both child and adult. So I think the first couple lines here really allude me to thinking like the images of home, the flannel gown, the whimsy of the word clamor. Like I think of a kid kind of cozying up in bed with no cares in the world, going into like those dreamlike kind of sequences too. Because then in the next stanza, he calls the night childish. He says this kind of right here. "This childish night, my companions lay frozen." So I also think back to that too. So maybe this journey kind of begins as a child, and maybe the narrator or whoever's telling us this is progressing as they sort of go along. And the child sails all night. And I think too, that's sort of a metaphor for just how we go about life and how we go about like life sort of progressing in that kind of sense. Most especially, I think that kind of speaks out where the lines here and the voice starts to take on that of an adult. So, and I gave my great sigh, the flakes came huddling. Were they really my end? In the darkness I turned to my rest. That's more of a kind of heavy sort of line that we have in there too, sort of that pinnacle of existence and achievement. So I think there are some parts of this that seem very cryptic. There are some parts of this poem that seem very philosophical. And some of the lines too that I know and I read in this poem as well, particularly this last stanza, I wrung from the darkness that the darkness flung me, is worthless as ignorance. Nothing comes from nothing, the darkness from the darkness. Pain comes from the darkness, and we call it wisdom. It is pain. Nothing comes from nothing, I think, can also be taken as kind of like a motivational sort of factor, that if you don't do anything, nothing sort of will result out of that. If you don't try, you cannot succeed. However, I think another interpretation of that, can kind of be like, well, it seems that the speaker in here had reached their north and it had meaning, but then became meaningless after a while. So I think that's kind of looking at that a little bit more and kind of the intentions of this. I'm not sure what Jarrell means in this last stanza. I'm really interested to see what you all think he means in this last stanza, but I can tell you that his great sense of loss, his loneliness, sort of that purpose, having lack of a purpose, that's certainly how he felt, and sometimes that's how he kind of portrayed that onto readers. He was very influenced by Freud, especially like a lot of theories of subconsciousness. So that can certainly be traced back to that child and that child's perspective, which I think is the best kind of way you can look at this poem, seemingly thinking about, at least what I think about, the different kind of voices that I feel coming out of this poem too. And so thinking about the point of view and thinking about how you kind of react to that as you're reading through the piece, I think is, I think that's particularly interesting. It's also interesting too, I mentioned this in my audio notes, but he died very tragically. He was hit by a car. So he didn't necessarily live he lived until his 50s, but not necessarily like a long, long, long life too. Even though this poem seems very abstract, it's very controlled. So if you'll notice, the stanzas are pretty even here. There's some rhyme endings in here. Sometimes they'll end on a short sentence after several long sentences, but the language is very finely chosen. Lots of sound, lots of clarity here, lots of personal voice. So I do think that's a pretty good attribute to this narrative that he kind of gives up here too. In a way, some have read this as a very meditative piece, and I don't think there's a wrong way to read it. I think, though, too, considering his background, when you listen to the notes that I provided on that, and then kind of reading this, his reputation as a poet, he definitely suffered in comparison with his career as a scholar and a literary critic. So a lot of people read more of his work towards that and not necessarily read as much as you would of his poetry kind of in this sense. So I think that has kind of contributed to how people kind of interpret his pieces. However, this is one of his most famous poems, and we'll look through his other poems too, but I think here, particularly to pay attention, really to pay attention as I'm going through and looking through some of these last stanzas, these last couple lines, and figuring out who's telling us this and why. Why are they really telling us this? So in terms of other Randall Jarrell poems on here, I'll show you a couple more. And your book includes here he is right there. I know there's just a little bit of kind of pictures in your book. We also have Well Water and Thinking of the Lost Wardles, as I mentioned here. But, from his biographies, you can read a little bit more about him. We're going to be looking at John Berryman this week, too. So they were kind of closely attributed in their time as writers. As you can see here, he was also connected with Robert Lowell. We'll be reading his poetry also. as you go through in terms of some of the other pieces here. But I encourage you, definitely listen, definitely read a little bit more. I'm going to break down some of his other themes. You might get some insights into him as a sort of World War II poet, because he was also writing along that same lines of that time. And so I don't know if you feel any of that in this poem, particularly when we look at thinking of the Lost World and some other pieces, you might get that. But identifying the language that you see here makes a lot of big sense. So you can also look on here. There's quite a bit more. Like I said, we only have 2 more poems in our book. But on here, my gosh, you have, a huge library, a huge inventory of Randall Jarrell pieces. So obviously we can't do all of them, but I encourage you, if you go on and you listen to some of these or you read some of these, tell us about it. Comment on it. I know it might take a little bit extra time, but if you're interested in researching him a little bit more, and if you're interested in writing about him a little bit more, you really should kind of take the time to do that and to look at him too. So I'm going to flip back to my other mode here. And here I am. So kind of going off of all of this, I'll leave you with reading a little bit more about Randall Jarrell. Please definitely listen to his other pieces. We'll have questions about him for next week. So definitely you want to go through. Poetry is not easy, but definitely you want to go through these pieces and as best as you can, try to interpret the significance, the meaning, what lines, what words stand out to you, and what you think kind of the overall context is of the actual poems. So.